Well, it's very nice meeting you.
You as well. Thank you so much for having me on. I love your bookshelf in the background. It's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I got a nice little setup here.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Well, thank you. I like yours with the world behind you.
Oh, thank you.
That's awesome. Well, I'm very excited to introduce you to my audience,
Mhm.
Elizabeth. You have an incredible an incredible ministry and career. Really, you started as an educator, so and then you have all the credentials really to talk about the subject of your book on sexuality and gender. So I am excited to introduce Elizabeth Urbanowicz. Is that the right word? How do I
Yes,
pronounce
yep.
your name?
So I pronounce it Urbanowitz, but however it
Urbanowicz.
comes out is great.
Is that Czech? Is that your
It's
background?
Polish.
Polish. All
Mhm.
right. Awesome. Well, I want to introduce you to my audience first of all. You are an educator. You actually also did a master's in apologetics when you started understanding that you needed some help, right, to be able to help your children see the world from a biblical worldview. And I love it that as an educator, there was a concern to you all along, right? You've noticed that we have you as an educator have to be equipped to be able to answer some really tough questions, and I believe that a lot of parents are going to benefit from your studies and your education concerning that. But she also has founded, she's the founder and CEO of Foundation Worldview, which is a ministry dedicated to equipping parents, teachers, and church leaders with tools to help the children in their care navigating today's culture with confidence and truth. Well, today's conversation, if you are a parent or if you have a child in your family, is one that you do not want to miss, because whether you are a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, a teacher, a youth worker, you name it, you care about your child or your friend's daughter, even spiritual formation. And she's going to help you to think differently about how to guide children into biblical worldview in the midst of this increasingly, surprisingly confusing environment that children are growing up in today. So, Elizabeth, welcome to God Size Stories.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on today, Patricia. It's a joy to be chatting with you.
Well, awesome. And we are going to be talking about this new book, and I have a copy right here. And Elizabeth, as all of my guests, she's giving away a copy of this book to someone in my audience. So stay through the end to learn more about the book, and then go to the show notes to follow Elizabeth, and also to enter the giveaway for a chance to win a copy of Helping Your Kids Know God's Good Design. And the subtitle is 40 questions and answers on sexuality and gender. What an important topic. Tell me, Elizabeth, how did this book come about? How was it born in your heart?
Yes. The funny thing is, I had no desire to write a book. I actually don't enjoy writing, and Harvest House came to me a few times and asked me about it. And I said, thanks so much, but go find somebody who wants to write a book because I don't. But really, the way that the Lord just led me to write this is at Foundation Worldview, the ministry that I run. We kept receiving questions from parents, very practical ones on how and when should I have the first sex talk with my child? How do I talk with my child about the fact that their aunt is in a same sex relationship? Or how do I talk with my child about the fact that we're seeing men who are now dressed like women? Or, how do I explain to my child, what pornography is and why we need to stay away from it? Just these very practical questions that our kids need to know the answers to, but are they can be very uncomfortable questions for us to discuss with our children. And so with the way that God has gifted me, there's many things I'm not good at. But the one thing I am good at is explaining hard things to kids in a really easy to understand language and examples. And so when we kept receiving questions about so many topics regarding gender and sexuality, I thought, I think there really could be an opportunity here to provide a very practical, easy to read book for parents and grandparents to work through with the children that God has placed in their care.
First of all, I want to tell you that you are about 10 years late in my book with this book when actually more than that, but my my oldest daughter is now 24. So
Mhm.
I had to have the the bees and the flowers talk with her
Mm,
when she was only 8 years old
mm, mhm,
because she was exposed to a sex talk at school.
mm, mm, mhm,
And she had some a kid that started just talking about sex with her, and
mhm,
she was very confused, 8 years old, and it just broke my heart that at 8 years old I had to get equipped to talk to my child about sex. And actually
mm,
broke my heart, and he actually caught me by surprise because I was like 12 years old when I heard the first time, when I
mhm.
knew. And so of course I should have been equipped. And so I'm glad that you're writing this now. And my question to you is, at what age do you recommend nowadays
Yes.
that parents start talking with their children about sex?
Yes. And the age that I recommend usually shocks people, but I say, just hear me out. I'm going to explain it. So I recommend actually younger than you even had to talk with your daughter. I recommend that parents have the first of many conversations about sex with their children starting at the age of 4, which I know that seems so young, but there's two main reasons for this. The first is that whoever is the first person to talk with us about a topic naturally becomes the expert in our minds. Like I just saw this a few weeks ago. I was driving down the road and my car started making a funny noise. And I was thinking, oh man, like is my car just getting older and it's making this noise, or is something wrong and do I need to take it to the shop? So I texted a friend and I said, hey, can I swing by your house tonight with my car and have your husband take a look at it? And she said, sure. So I pulled up to their house. Her husband comes out and he's like, Elizabeth, I'm happy to take your car for a test drive, but why are you asking me to do this? I don't know anything about cars. And I started laughing and I had to think for a minute. And I was like, that's a great question. Why am I asking you to do this? You don't know anything about cars. And I realized that the first month that I had moved to the state where I now live, I had gotten a flat tire while driving, and my friend's husband came to my rescue, changed the tire, and then pointed me to a garage where I could get the tire changed permanently. And so in my mind, he's now the expert in our area on
Wow.
cars. And it's similar to with our children and this topic of sexuality. That whoever is the first person to introduce them to this topic will subconsciously become the expert in their minds. So if
Wow.
we want our children to come to us with their questions, their curiosities, their fears, their concerns, we need to make sure that we're the ones that are having the first conversation with them so that they naturally view us as the expert. The second reason is when we look at scripture and what the Bible has to say about sex and sexuality, we see that sex within marriage is a good gift from God, that He's given it to us humans as the way that we are fruitful and multiply, that we have children, that we fill the earth and subdue it. He's given it as a way of creating intimacy between spouses. And it's an inherently good thing where if we wait until our children are exposed to something that they should not have been exposed to, then we have to go into backtracking mode and we have to explain to them how what they just saw doesn't align with God's good design before they even know what that design is. And so those are the two main reasons I recommend parents have the first of many conversations with their children. As a bonus, if you start that conversation when your child is 4, there's only one person in the conversation who feels awkward, and that's you as the adult. A
It is
4-year old
so
feels
true.
no awkwardness at that age. And now I know sometimes the pushback that I get from parents is saying, oh, but if I start this conversation at 4, Elizabeth, I'm just stealing my child's innocence. I'm just taking away their innocence. And that's when I usually respond with a question. And I say, so are you saying that sex is an inherently dirty thing and our children are better off before they know about it? And
Wow.
I think that's important for us to think through because that's not the biblical perspective. Now, have we humans in our fallen state corrupted God's good design in a million ways? Absolutely. And there are things that are very dirty and that are sinful that are all around us. However, at its base, human sexuality is a good thing. And so if we think that we're somehow taking our children's innocence, I think we need to really evaluate how are we viewing human sexuality and are we viewing it through the lens that scripture presents? Because when we talk with our children about the gift of sexuality at a young age and help them understand the appropriate boundaries. For example, when we explain their private parts and what they are, and how a girl's body is different than a boy's body, and how no one should be touching or looking at this part of your body aside from your parents who are caring for you or a doctor who's examining you, we're actually helping protect our children. What actually steals our children's innocence is when someone or something exposes them
Yes.
to a deviant forms of God's of sexuality, of what's not God's good design. So that's where I really encourage parents to really have a mindset shift that it's not stealing our children's innocence, it's helping build the foundation of what God has designed, and then it's protecting their innocence so that when they encounter something that goes against God's good design, they're able to then tell you so that you can work to further protect them from that.
Yeah. Now, Elizabeth, when I think about it that way, so I was on the same book as you because now I'm thinking about sex and I'm thinking about the honey and the flowers and the bees and the flowers. But I actually had that conversation with my girls. I have two girls. When
Mm,
they were about 4 years old or so, 3, 4 years old, I actually sat down with them
mm,
to have that conversation about their intimate parts
mhm,
and how they
mhm,
were, that they were private and just that they should be guarding that they shouldn't have
mhm,
anybody allow anybody to touch or look, just like what you
mhm,
said. I
mhm,
had that conversation. I kind of didn't think about it as sex, but it really is a very first conversation you should
mhm,
have with your
mhm,
kids, right? So that
mhm.
that leads me to my next question. Did I do good? I mean, is that what your first conversation with a 4-year-old should be like?
Yes, yes, good question. Absolutely. That is the first conversation that I recommend having. That I recommend parents have three conversations at three different times. You don't need to sit down with a 4-year-old and explain everything. And it doesn't need to be a
Yeah.
big sit down moment. It can just be, when you're baking cookies in the kitchen, or you're playing
Hmm.
blocks on the floor, or you're driving to soccer practice. But yes, that is the first conversation that I recommend parents having, just the difference between a girl's body and a boy's body and what parts our children have. Now, for you, that conversation was probably a little bit more difficult because you have two girls. And so all they were used to seeing was a girl's body, where, like if you had a girl and a boy, they're used to bathing together or seeing diapers change. And so it's easier to explain the different parts. But I recommend that parents open up the conversation just by asking their child what their favorite toy is, and then saying, how do we treat this favorite toy or this special toy different than we treat your other toys? Maybe your child keeps the toy up on a high shelf so their younger child or their younger sibling can't get to it. Maybe they keep it in their room when company comes over so that other people can't touch it. Or maybe they never take this toy out, in the car or to the park to protect it. And then you can say, just as we have special toys that we treat in a different way than we treat all our other toys, God has given us special parts of our body that we should treat with more care than any other part of the body. Now, this is where you're going to want to include the anatomically correct language. So, for any parents who are listening with children in the room, just to let you know, give you a warning in case you want to pause this, I am going to say the anatomically correct term. So for a
Yes, all
girl,
right.
you can say, the special part of your body that God has given you is called your vagina. And then explain the special part of a boy's body that God has given him is called his penis. And then say, these parts of our body are good and they're special. They were designed by God. And you know what? They're so special that no one should look at this part of your body or try to touch this part of your body unless your dad and I or your mom and I are taking care of you or a doctor is examining you to make sure that you're healthy. And you know what? When we're out in public, you can call this part of your body your private part because this is a part of your body we're going to keep private. And you can ask your child if they have any questions. And this is sometimes a scary part for parents because they think, oh my goodness, what if my child asks me a question, that I don't I don't know how to answer, or I don't want to answer, or I just don't know. And that's where I say, just keep your poker face on, keep a smile on your face. And you just want to affirm the fact that your child has asked you a question because you want them to continue to come to you. And so you can just say, that is such a good question. I am so grateful that God has given you a mind that thinks, you know what, I'm going to need a little bit more time to think about that question. So we'll come back tomorrow and we'll talk about it. And you just bought yourself another 24 hours. You can pray through it, do some research, deep
Get the
breathing,
brown
talk with your
bag and
spouse.
just breathe hard on it.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
the first
it's
conversation. Very basic. The second conversation, similar. This is going to be the basic mechanics of sex. And this is the hardest conversation to have. But I recommend starting it off by asking your child if they've ever made a promise to someone. And then you can, if they've never made a promise, you can talk about a promise you've made to them and say, do you remember that I promised that if you cleaned up your room, we would get to go to the park, or any promise you've made to them. And then you can say, did you know that marriage is a promise? That's right. When a man and a woman get married, they make a promise to God and to one another that they're going to love one another and care for one another for as long as they're both alive. And they're going to love and care for one another in a way that they don't love and care for anyone else. Then you can explain that sometimes when people make promises, they do special things with their bodies to confirm that promise. Like they might shake hands, they might lock pinkies. You can explain, when you purchased your home, you had to sign your name to a whole bunch of papers to promise you were going to pay for that house. And you can say, just like people sometimes shake hands or lock pinkies or sign contracts, God has given a special act to confirm the promise of marriage. Again, this is the most uncomfortable part. You can say, the act that God has given is called sex, and then explain it very briefly that sex is when a man places his penis inside of a woman's vagina. And you can say, this act reminds the husband and the wife of the promise that they made to God and to one another to love and care for one another for as long as they're both alive. Okay. Then you've said it. And I can trust me, the first time I had to say this on a podcast or a radio interview, I thought I was going to die. Now this is probably the 50th time that I've said it and I have no problems. And it's similar with you as the parent. The first time you say it, you're going to feel like, how can I ever possibly say these words out loud? But after you
yeah.
get through it the first time, it's easier. And then you ask your child if they have any questions so that they know that you want them to come to you when they have questions or curiosities. If they ask you something strange or something you just don't even know if it's appropriate to answer, keep that poker face on and buy yourself 24 more hours. And then the final conversation, I think, to have, again, don't have these right in a row, spread them out over several weeks or months. The final conversation I think to have to just introduce this topic is the conversation of reproduction. And so I recommend you go for a walk throughout the neighborhood and just notice all of the trees and the flowers and the plants that are growing, and ask your child, do you know how this flower got here or how this tree got here? And explain that when a seed fell into the ground, it received water when it rained and sunlight when the sun was shining. And eventually it grew into this beautiful plant. And then you can say, did you know that God created your body with something similar to seeds? And then if you have a girl, you can say the kind of seeds that God has placed in your body are called eggs. And you can explain these are not like chicken eggs. They're very, very, very tiny. And then you can explain the type of seed that God has given boys is called sperm. And you can explain that when a man's sperm meets a woman's egg, a baby begins to grow inside the mother's womb. And you can say, we've seen so many moms who have babies growing inside of them. And you can say, you may have wondered how the baby got there. Well, the answer, remember when we had that conversation about the promise of marriage and how God has given sex to confirm the promise of marriage? Well, sex is how the baby gets there. When a husband places his penis inside of a wife's vagina, his penis releases sperm. And if those sperm connect with an egg, a baby begins to grow inside of the mom. Again, ask your children if they have any questions. Keep that poker face on and buy yourself 24 more hours if you need it.
Yes. And you said something that I wish I had heard or thought about 16 years ago when I had that first conversation. And I made a mistake, I believe, in my trying to make it right. I read this entire book about, women and sexuality and how to explain for a child. A mom explained to a daughter about sex and stuff. And the mistake that I made was that I went on and on and on and on instead of making it very simple, like you said,
Mm.
and just explaining it in a very simple way the first time, um, and allow for your child to just sit with it for a little bit and even develop more questions in their minds. And what an important advice that you're giving here, because in my attempt to being extra careful, in my attempt to just not creating confusion, I'm afraid that I
Mhm.
kind of like talk too much. Which, can you believe that I talk too much? You don't know me, but that's just me. Anybody that knows me knows that, like Patricia, less is more, when it comes to words, especially when it comes to kids. And so I think that that is such an important thing, to be very, not that you're going to leave things out. You
Mhm.
are going to talk about things that are hard, but you
Mhm.
don't have to expand it too much, at least in the very beginning, right? And I
In
think that
the
that
early
was such a
stages, yeah.
yeah, so you talked about, just making it several conversations, don't
Hmm.
make it walk more awkward than it has to be
Hmm.
in your mind, right? Because you know all about it, but the kid does not. So that's
Hmm.
the thing that I think that we come with from the premise that we know what sex is,
Hmm.
we know all the implications when you open that door. There are so many other questions that will come,
Hmm.
and society will come with a slew of things that are happening
Hmm.
nowadays. Even 16 years ago, we weren't even dealing with these things when we were
Hmm.
first talking to our children about sex. And so in our mind, I think we get over prepared by something that in a little kid's mind is brand new. So you should explain it that way. I love that.
Yeah. Well, and one thing, that you're saying, Patricia, I think this is the beauty of parents having these conversations because parents aren't going to have these conversations perfectly. Maybe you say too much or you share too much, or maybe you don't say enough, or maybe, you wait a little bit too late. But the beauty is that God has given you that relationship with your child. And so even if the first time or the second time or the third time you think, man, I really messed that up. Well, you know what? You're still that child's parent the next day. And you can come
Mhm.
back to them, the next day or the next week or the next month and say, do you remember when we talked about that? I think I did too much talking and not enough listening. So I want to revisit that conversation and ask you, do you have any questions about
Mhm.
this? And that's the beautiful thing about the parent-child relationship is you're always going to be your child's mom. And so you can
Yes.
always come back and say, let's revisit this conversation, even if it doesn't go well the first time.
Absolutely. Now, Elizabeth, a question. I had two girls, as I told you, and so I didn't have to have the conversation with a boy, right? So my
Hmm.
question to you is, if we have a dynamic at home where either the dad is traveling or the dad finds it awkward, or the mom is even looking more at ways of presenting this better to a boy, do you is that ideal? I mean, in other questions, would it be ideal for the dad to talk to the boy? What is
Hmm.
your point of view on that?
Yes, I think in the younger years, I think it's not so much important the gender of the parent who's having the conversation because at those young ages, naturally around 4, 5, 6, children are probably spending more time with their moms than with their dads. Now, that's not true in every family, but for many families, it is. And at those young ages, this, unless, God forbid, there's some form of abuse that's going on, this is just very much an intellectual
Mhm.
exercise. The kids do not yet have any sexual desires. They haven't gone through puberty. So it's not so much a time when things are very, very different for girls than for boys. So I think at these younger ages, a mom might really desire for her husband to be part of the conversation. And I think if she does, then it's a great thing to ask if he would be part of the conversation, and so the two of you could have this conversation together. But if that's just not feasible or realistic for where you are, I would say that moms having the conversation with their sons is perfectly acceptable and it's a really good thing to have these conversations early. Now, as children grow, as they're reaching like 10, 11, 12, and they're going through puberty and things are starting to change, their bodies are changing, their hormones are starting to rage. They are starting to, some of them develop some more sexual desires. I think at that stage,
if it's possible for the parent who's the same gender as the child to have these, deeper, more in-depth conversations with them, I think that can be a really good thing. But let's say, if there's a mom who's a widow or she's divorced or dad just, isn't present, you're still equipped to have these conversations with your son. You might not be able to speak into it experientially. However, you can get advice, from your husband or from other males in your life, who know you and love you and have that conversation with your son. So I would encourage you, any moms who are in that situation with boys who are older, don't get discouraged and don't buy into the lie that since you're not a male, you should just not have these conversations with your son, because it's so much better for you to have these conversations with your child imperfectly than for you to not have them at all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's good advice. Well, your book talks about it's 40 questions on and answers on sexuality and gender. There are some very tricky subjects
Mm,
that you talk about in the book. For example, a lot of parents probably have this question, like, how do I talk to my child about tricky subjects like masturbation or
mm,
pornography? And you
mhm,
address this in your book. Can you
mhm.
tell us a little bit about for just this example, for instance?
Yes. So, masturbation and pornography are tricky topics to talk about, and I think they're two separate conversations. So, I'll start off with the pornography one first, because that's one that our children, may face at a younger age. I know that.
Absolutely.
So, my background is in elementary education. I spent a decade teaching third grade at a Christian school just outside of Chicago. And I know that many of my third graders were exposed to pornography, either accidentally, just stumbling across it on the computer, or there were instances where one of the students in my class had been exposed to it, and then another student would go over their house for a play date, and they would introduce them to this. And so, years ago, it was if you wanted to be exposed to pornography, you had to go to, some shady store, at the corner of the block. You had to be a certain age. Where nowadays, the porn industry is predatory, that it's seeking to get children younger and younger, because the younger it can get them, the more dollars it gets, from them over their lifetime. So this is a conversation we do have to be very proactive about, and we have to grow with them as our children grow. Like, for example, I'm going to recommend again, this, I know this is going to shock people, but just hear me out. I recommend having the first conversation about pornography, but not calling it pornography, just calling it bad pictures around the age of 4, simply because the average age of exposure to pornography nowadays is 8, which that's the average age, which means that for some children it's younger. So we want to prepare our children before there's any risk, or when there's very low risk of them being exposed to pornography. So the way I recommend having this conversation, with a 4, 5, or 6-year old, is just go on a picture walk around your house and just talk about all of the good pictures that you have hanging up. Show your kids your wedding picture. Oh, this picture reminds us of how much mommy and daddy love one another. Or show a picture of your cousins, and oh, this picture reminds us how much we love our cousins. Or a picture of your pet, how much you love your pet, or from a family vacation, and talk about all of the good pictures that you have. And then just simply explain that because of sin, not all pictures are good pictures. And you can explain that sometimes because of sin, people take videos or pictures of others without clothes covering those special parts of the body that a bathing suit was designed to cover. And you can say these are bad pictures because they're not treating the people in them like they bear God's image, and they're not treating the people who look at them like they bear God's image. And so then say, if you ever see a bad picture, if you ever see a video or a picture of people without clothes covering those special parts of a body that the bathing suit was designed to cover, I want you to remember stop, run, and tell, and just go over stop, run, and tell. So the first thing, if you see that bad picture or video, I want you to stop looking at it right away. Then I want you to run to me or the nearest safe adult, and I want you to tell me what you saw. And when you do, I'm going to be so proud of you for telling me what you saw so that I can protect you from seeing that kind of bad picture again. And you just want to go over stop, run, and tell, and then wrap it up with another good picture walk around your house. Go and look at some other pictures that are good. So you always want to put the focus on what's good, what God has designed, but just explaining the basics of how sin has corrupted that design. Obviously, if then you're talking to a 9 or 10-year-old, you're not going to use the word bad pictures, that's when you're going to introduce the
Yes.
term
The
pornography.
pornography.
And
Mhm.
you'll explain at the older ages that it's not just pictures or videos of people without clothes on. It might actually be pictures or videos of people engaging in sex. And so just explaining to your kids, but still keep that same three-step formula, that stop, run, and tell. I used to tell my third graders that if they ever saw a bad picture like that they might have one of two reactions, that they might feel really embarrassed by what they just saw, and they're not going to want to tell anyone because they feel so embarrassed, or they might feel curious and they might want to see more pictures like that. But I would say, whether you feel embarrassed or you feel curious, I want you to stop looking at it right away, run right to me and tell me what you saw, and just emphasize that I'm going to be so proud of you. Because if we freak out when our kids saw something, they're not going to want to
Yes.
tell us in the future, because they're going to feel like, oh, I did something bad. This is my fault. Where most of the time, it's just that it's a predatory industry that went looking for them. So we want them to know, I'm going to be so proud of you. And even if on the inside we're
Absolutely.
freaking out and thinking, oh my goodness, what did my child just see? Our first response has to be, I'm so proud of you. Thank you for telling me. So that's how I would recommend starting the conversation about pornography. Masturbation does not have to be at the age 4, thank God.
Yeah.
But it does have to be earlier than when we would think of it in the past. I know my mom probably explained the concept of masturbation to me around the age of 12 or 13, where I think nowadays we probably have to have the conversation around the age of 10, simply because even if our children are very sheltered, many states have sex ed standards where they recommend introducing the concept of masturbation around the age of 8. So even if our children aren't being exposed to that, children their age are being exposed to that.
Mm.
And so we want to make sure that we have the first conversation. And so the way that I recommend having this conversation is just first talking with our kids about, why did God design sex? And when we look at scripture, we see three main reasons. That we see that God has given the gift of sex within marriage to create children. He's given the gift of sex within marriage to create intimate knowledge between a husband and a wife, so that they get to know one another in a way that no one else knows them. And then we see that marriage is a picture of Jesus and the church. So that doesn't just mean that sex is that picture, but sex is included within marriage. So it's also a picture of Jesus and the church. And so make sure our kids understand, okay, these are three of the main purposes that God has given sex within marriage. And then explain, sometimes what people will do is they will touch their private parts. They'll touch their penis or their vagina in a way that makes it feel like they're having sex. And then say, we need to figure out if this is what God designed. And so then say, okay, if someone is off by themselves, they're just by themselves, can they be fruitful and multiply? Can they have more children? No, a man's body and a woman's body are needed for that. So this doesn't align with that purpose. And then say, okay, God also gave the gift of sex so that a husband and a wife would get to know one another in a way that nobody else knows them. If one person is by themselves, are they getting to know their husband or their wife? No, they're not. They're just by themselves. And say, okay, we also know that sex is part of marriage, and marriage is a picture of Jesus and the church. So if one person is by themselves, is that a picture of Jesus and the church? No, that's not. It can't be with just one person. So we can say, so this, when people touch their private parts in a way that makes them feel like they're having sex, it doesn't fit any of God's purposes for sex. So this is not something that God designed, and this is not something that we're going to engage with. So that would be my recommendation for that
Wow.
conversation.
I have to say, I've never heard it explained that way. I
Mm,
love it. It's just a very, although you worded it so we could talk to children, I think this is a very good concept for anyone to
mhm,
understand, the masturbation issue, for instance, which we know is not an issue just with children, right? So,
mhm.
so I
Right.
think I think that the way that you explain it makes even us adults think of it in a different light,
Mm,
right?
mhm,
It's a very biblically sound, when you think about the fact that sex was designed, and therefore the pleasure of sex was designed to be enjoyed with your husband or with your wife within the uh, marriage.
mhm,
That just really brings it not necessarily to a place of condemnation, but a place of
mhm,
understanding.
mhm,
But a better understanding of why it's not. the right thing to do. It's
Mm.
not a healthy thing, because we know that this is being pushed more and more
Mhm.
by, even by some Christian
Yes.
sex therapists, as a way of, discovering your own body and this and that and the
Mm-hmm.
other. So it's a hot topic. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think that I love the way that you. So I think that this is for my adult audience, which is everybody pretty much that listens to my show. I think that this will be fruitful for them personally as well. I
Mm-hmm.
do believe. Um, so the other thing is, we know that 16 years ago, when I had to explain for the first time sex to my child, we did not have what we have today, very prevalent in our society, which is the LGBTQ plus material that's being pushed, right? Not only in social media, but even in public settings, in public schools, as early as kindergarten in some states. We know that. So my question to you is, for a parent who knows that their child may be exposed to that, whether they are going to a public school or they are going to be exposed anyway. If they
Yes.
only, they're going to. How do we prepare our children for all of this
Mm-hmm.
material that they are going to be
Mm-hmm.
exposed to?
Yes. So I recommend that we think of whatever we need to prepare them for, that we think of a three-step formula. That first we need to explain what is God's good design. Because anytime we find a corruption of God's good design, there's always the basic basis of that design. So we need to think through what is the goodness of that design. Then we need to look at and explain how has sin corrupted that good design. And then the third step is how has Jesus redeemed that? So, first, God's good design, the corruption of sin, redemption in Jesus. So, if we're I'll walk us through thinking through explaining same-sex relationships to our children and then explaining transgenderism. And so when we're thinking about same-sex relationships, we need to think, well, what did God design? What is the goodness of God's design? And that is marriage. And we need to make sure our children understand, right from Genesis chapter 2, that marriage is one man and one woman becoming one flesh for life. At the end of Genesis chapter 2, Moses writes, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And so that's one man, one woman becoming one flesh for life. And then in Ephesians 5, Paul expands on that picture and he explains the same thing that Moses says. And then he says, but I say this refers to Christ and the church. So marriage is a picture of Jesus and the church. And so we need to make sure that our kids just know that as the basis, and then you can talk about your own marriage or other marriages, and say, yes, all these marriages are one man and one woman becoming one flesh for life, and they're a picture of Jesus and the church. And then you're going to want to explain how sin has corrupted this. And a simple way to explain this to kids is to say, because of sin, sometimes we might desire the wrong kind of love in a relationship. And so you can explain sometimes two men might desire to share in the type of love that God designed for marriage. And then say, is this what God designed? It's two men in marriage. And then say, well, no, it's not one man and one woman becoming one flesh for life. And you can say, two men can't become one flesh in the way that God designed. Then you can say, well, marriage is also a picture of Jesus and the church. Can two men make that picture? No, that would be a picture of Jesus and Jesus. And then say, so is this what God designed? No, it's not. And then you can say the same thing might happen with women. Two women might desire to share in the type of love that God designed for marriage. Is this what God designed? And then go through those two things again, and it's not. And then you can wrap it up by saying, you know what? One day when Jesus comes back, he's going to make heaven and earth new. And when he does, no one is going to struggle with wanting the wrong kind of love in a relationship because Jesus died for our sins and rose again to new life. So now anyone who turns from their sin and trusts in him will live with Jesus forever in the new heaven and the new earth where we will never desire the wrong kind of love in a relationship. So again, that three-step formula, the goodness of God's design, how sin has corrupted it, and then wrapping it up with the gospel. Similarly, for transgenderism, I recommend starting off and thinking about, well, what is the goodness? The goodness is that God has designed us in his image as male or female. So we want to take our kids right to Genesis 1:27, which says, therefore, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And talk about what truths are revealed. God designed us in his image, and he designed us as either male or female. So that's the goodness of God's design. Then we want to explain how sin has corrupted it and say, because of sin, sometimes feelings trick us. And you can talk about times when your feelings have tricked you. You can actually get very vulnerable and say, do you remember last week when I asked you to clean up your room and you didn't do it? And I came in and I did need to discipline you for being disobedient, but you know what? I yelled at you and I screamed at you and I slammed the door. I let my feelings of anger trick me into believing that yelling and screaming were the right thing to do. And that was not the right thing to do because I wasn't treating you like you were created in God's image. You can say sometimes the way people's feelings trick them is that a boy might have a boy's body, and the truth is that God created him as a boy, but he might like some of the things that a lot of girls like. And his feelings might trick him into believing that he's actually a girl and that he should change his body to be a girl's body. You can explain the same thing can happen for females, that females' feelings can trick them into believing that they are actually boys. And so then explain again with the gospel. But you know what? Jesus died for our sin. He rose again to new life. And one day he's going to come back and make heaven and earth new. And when he does, our feelings are no longer going to trick us. I'm no longer going to get tricked by my anger into thinking that yelling and screaming are the right things. People who are designed as boys who might like a lot of things that girls like, they're no longer going to be tricked into thinking that they're girls. They're just going to know that God designed them uniquely as a male, and they're going to enjoy that. And so again, three-step formula. What's God's good design? How has sin corrupted it? And then what's the hope of the gospel?
Yes, which we call it the perfect sandwich, and that actually is a formula that people use even in human resources at companies when they are going to discipline or not discipline, but they're going to do some sort of disciplinary action with an employee. They start with the good and they tell what's wrong and then they finish with the good, right? It's a perfect sandwich for good outcomes. It really is, because you're not just slamming the person with the issue. You are showing what's good first, right? And showing them that there is a good way of doing things. And in our case, because we're believers, we use the Bible, of course, as a reference for our behavior. Well, um, Elizabeth, talk to a parent out there. Some of us, we did not live up to biblical standards before marriage, right? And so we have that situation. We all face that. I know that I faced that. Where you're going to talk to your child and you know that you didn't follow the biblical stance for marriage and for sex or whatever. Even in some cases, even sexual identity, right? Even sexuality, sorry, as a heterosexuality or homosexuality. So how can a parent not feel hypocritical talking to a child now that they believe? Now, sometimes, like in my case, I didn't come to Jesus until I was 25 years old. And so like you are not going to lie to your child, but so you don't want to feel hypocritical. What is your advice for that parent?
Yes. Well, this is a conversation that unless your child directly asks you, I don't think you need to have this conversation at the younger ages. This is a conversation I think, once they're going through puberty and they're starting to go through the struggles, because it is a struggle to follow God's design. It's because we're living in a fallen world and we are sinful. And so it is a struggle. So I recommend, waiting until your child is maybe 11 or 12 years old. And I recommend being honest with them in a way that is beneficial, because we can be overly honest with our kids in a way that is not going to help us and not going to help them. For example, if there's a mom who, before she got married or before she came to Christ, engaged in multiple sexual relationships with men that she dated, explaining this in detail to a child or, like giving names or circumstances, that's not helpful for the mom to relive all of those things. And that's not helpful for the child to hear all those things. So I recommend thinking through beforehand, maybe even jotting a few notes down, how you can have this conversation in a way that's going to be honest with your child, but ultimately pointing to God's goodness. So I recommend, having this conversation saying, we've talked a lot about sex over the years and we've talked about God's design for sex. Well, now that you're getting older, it's going to be a lot harder to follow God's design. When you were 5, it was no big deal. But now that, you're growing into a woman or now that you're growing into a man, it's going to be a lot harder to follow the goodness of God's design. And then I recommend, you just briefly explain that, when I was growing up, I actually didn't follow God's good design. And then just briefly saying, when I was in college, I dated a bunch of different guys, and some of the guys that I dated, I had sex with. Don't get into any more detail than that. And then you can briefly explain some of the consequences of that because we want our kids to know that when we don't follow
Absolutely.
God's design, there are consequences. So, whether the consequence was an unplanned pregnancy or the consequence was, just heartache, because when
Yep.
you attach yourself physically to someone, it's really hard emotionally when you break up. And just
Yeah.
briefly explain, and because I didn't follow God's design, whenever we broke up, it was so much harder and more painful to break
Mm.
up because we had actually bonded in a way that God only designed for husbands and wives to bond. And so breaking that bond was so painful. But then don't leave things there. Wrap it up with the hope of the gospel and say, but you know what? Jesus has rescued me from my sin. And so, my sin of engaging in those sexual relationships before marriage, that's something that Jesus paid for in his death on the cross. And you know what? When God looks at me, he doesn't see a woman who had sex before marriage, he sees the righteousness of Jesus. Isn't that amazing? So, wrap it up with that hope of the gospel and say, I'm sharing this with you just because I want you to know that it's going to be hard. And I understand how hard that is, but I want you to follow God's good design and I want to save you from that pain and that heartache that I had to go through. But I want you to know that even if you do engage with sin, and even if you do sin in that way, that God's grace is always available. So that's what I recommend, keeping the details very brief, explaining some of the consequences, and then wrapping it up with the gospel so that your
Mm.
children know that there is always hope in Jesus.
Well, I have one more question for you before I let you go. This is such a wonderful conversation, Elizabeth. I'm grateful. I'm grateful that today's parents are going to have some very practical advices for as they face this difficult scenario that we face, different environment, than even not that long ago I faced with my children.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very grateful for what God has called you to do, Elizabeth, first of all. And, I love what you have put together here and highly, highly, highly recommend this book for every parent, grandparent, educator who just wants to know, because I know that you have the questions and I know that you see things. Maybe they are not asking questions, but you know that there's some things need to be addressed. And this is an incredible book for you to get equipped to talk to your children or the children in your life about God's good design for us. But as we finish, I one of the things that I have faced, I have a friend who has had two of their children actually transition, and it was a very heartbreaking situation.
Mm-hmm.
And my children were older, so I didn't have to
Mm-hmm.
necessarily explain things, and
Mm-hmm.
they were already teenagers when this was
Mm-hmm.
happening. But how do I prepare my child, if it's a parent,
Mm-hmm.
to interact with a family member,
Mm-hmm.
or a child of a friend, of mama's friend who is
Yeah.
transition?
Yeah.
Help a parent who's going through that.
Yes. So I'm going to give some very basic recommendations. I do, even in the book, I do recommend that for these situations that parents do also seek out counsel at your local church with pastors or elders or other godly mentors, because I can give some basic recommendations that I think are wise in any situation, but every situation is so different, depending who it is and what the past relationship looks like, what the present relationship looks like. So I would recommend take my recommendations with a grain of salt and then, talk with those who can offer you sound godly counsel for your specific situation. So, what I recommend in the book is that we teach our kids just, I'm realizing now, I'm like, wow, I must really like threes. I'm teaching kids a simple three-step formula for when
Yeah.
we interact with anyone who's not following God's good design. The first is recognize. We want to recognize this isn't God's good design. The second is we want to remind ourselves of the truth. So I recommend teaching your children a simple phrase that they can say in their minds when they see someone, whether it's a loved one or a friend or just a stranger, who's not living according to God's good design. So in this case with gender, the phrase would be God designed us as male or female. God's design is good. So they can say that to themselves and then be kind. That our job is to love others. So we're going to love this person like we would love any other person. Now, this is going to look different in different situations, So I recommend, if this is a family member who's transitioned, and maybe you're going to spend Thanksgiving with them, that you just explain to your child, we're going to see our cousin Jake at Thanksgiving, but right now, just like we've talked about sometimes happens, because of sin, Jake is letting his feelings trick him. And Jake actually believes that he is a girl. So he's going to be dressed like a girl and he is going to be going by the name Julia, or whatever name he's going by. And then remind your kids of those three steps. So when we see Jake, we're going to recognize this isn't God's good design. And in our minds, we're going to remind ourselves that God designed us as male or female and God's design is good. And then we're going to be kind to Jake. And so then coach your kids through what that looks like. And now it's hard enough for us as adults to try to navigate this, so for kids, it's going to be wildly complicated. So I recommend saying, if you're uncomfortable, you can just stick by me. You can just stick by me and you can just watch me as I interact with Jake. But you can even think through maybe some questions your child could ask and just say, you can ask, how is school going? Or are you still playing soccer? So you can coach them on some questions that they can ask. But I recommend in really tricky situations like that, tell your child it's okay if they just want to stick by you and you can they can just watch you and you can coach them through the situation because it is really difficult. I have a friend whose oldest child has transitioned or is transitioning from male to female. And the younger children, this friend has just instructed her children who are out of the house to say, this is your relationship with your brother. You get to decide if you're going to call him by this name that he has preferred. Where for her children who are still in the house, she's like, when you're out of the house, you get to decide, but you're still living in our house. We're not going to lie. So we are still going to call him, by his given name. We're still going to call him him. We're going to be kind, but we're not going to engage in this lie. And so, depending on the situation and how old your children are, it depends on how you're going to guide them. But I do recommend that parents not make things too complicated for their children and not put them, in situations where it's just going to be, I mean, it's so hard for us as adults, to navigate this. So just, allow your kids to stick close by you so that they don't have to bear the weight of this on their own.
Absolutely. It's very, very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a simple subject, is it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I always, because it kind of hit a little close when it's a friend that's going through,
Mm-hmm.
it makes you think, right? What if it was you? Like, what would you do?
Mm-hmm.
You always love your child forever,
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm-hmm.
regardless of what they choose, you will
Mm-hmm.
always love them. And so this is not an easy subject.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something that people, that I believe that believers have engaged in the mistake of not complicating things, just being very like, this is what the Bible says, and this is it's not that easy when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to people that you love dearly, especially if it's your child. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think that you gave a very good advice when you said we look at the Bible as the structure of everything we believe. I always say when people say, you know, want to call me whatever because of what I believe, I say, well, I happen to this. I have decided that there's a book that I follow, and what's in that book is my standards for living. Now, what you choose is your prerogative, but this is my standard of living, and just as I need to be respected for that as well, right? But
Mm-hmm.
but it's very, very complicated subject. And I think you give great advice when you say, uh, look for a therapist, a believer, a Christian therapist that will help you in this horrible situation that you're facing right now, maybe as a mom or as a dad even, or as a grandparent. I think that it's important that we seek help, no question, about it. And I think the last advice that you give, which is treating people with love and kindness, and just like Jesus would, he says sin no more, but he still loved on them. So I love it, Elizabeth. What a great conversation. I love what you're doing, and the ministry that you are heading is really helping so many people. In your website, over 20,000 people have been able to find information and material. So if you are listening to this and you need to get equipped for whatever reason. Well, I think that everybody should get equipped nowadays, because we all have children in our lives, that have difficult questions, or we will have children in our lives that will have difficult questions. So this incredible book, Helping Your Kids Know God's Good Design, is a great resource for your library. It's definitely in my library now, and I highly recommend it. And again, Elizabeth is giving away a copy of her book to someone in my audience. Just go to the show notes to connect with Elizabeth, connect with her website for all kinds of resources that you're going to have there, and also for a chance to win a copy of this book. Elizabeth, what a pleasure it was to talk to you. And
thanks so much, Patricia. It's really been a joy to have this conversation.
thank you so much. And God bless you in what you're doing, and strengthen you, because I know that you're getting a lot of heat, girl.
That's true.
Well, God bless you.
Thank you. You as well, Patricia.
Yes.